Hello, and welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto, attorney at law in the state of Michigan, where I've been practicing law now for almost 24 years, specializing in consumer protection and lemon law. People often call my office when they've got a problem with a car. And I've also written quite a bit for Jalopnik's subblog Car Buying and also Opposite Lock, plus I wrote a book called The Lemon Law Bible. So people call my office because they got a problem with a car. It could be anything from a car purchase gone wrong, an auto repair gone wrong, and quite often an oil change gone wrong. So today we're going to talk about oil change horror stories. I've represented probably a dozen or two of people in my career who brought their vehicle into an oil change place and had the oil change place do something wrong, which often results in a destroyed engine. So there's things you can do, what to watch out for, and how to handle it if it happens to you. And one of my favorite cases, and by favorite I mean just simply it's a great example I can talk about. It wasn't a good thing that happened to my client, but a very good friend of mine. In fact, years ago, I've mentioned this before, I worked in radio for many, many years, and I was even a disc jockey. And so when I went to law school, I stayed friends with many of my disc jockey friends. And after I got out of law school and started practicing law, one of my good friends, a disc jockey, called me up and he said, "Steve, my brand new car, I took it in for its first oil change." And in fact, this was a Jeep Wrangler. And the Jeep Wrangler, in the owner's manual, said you had to bring it in one time for an early oil change. In fact, I owned a Jeep Wrangler a few years later, and I remember doing this. You bring the vehicle in for a very early oil change. As the engine breaks in, the theory is there might be extra stuff in the oil that needs to come out. He brought it in for its very first oil change, and when they took it back there, they did the work on it, they give him back the vehicle. He gets in it, he drives down the road, he makes it about a block, and the dashboard lights up like a Christmas tree. And he immediately shuts the engine off and he walks back to the oil change place and says, "Hey guys, something's wrong with my vehicle." And a mechanic looks at him and says, "Oh my God, I forgot to put oil back in your car." I mean, it popped into his head suddenly, "Oh, I forgot to put the oil back in." Now, one thing about this particular case is this was not a quickie oil change place. This was a service center in Flint, Michigan, that specializes actually in tires. They sell a lot of tires, but they also advertise they do basic stuff to cars, tune-ups, brake jobs, and oil changes. And it was right down the street from the radio station I used to work at. And so my friend took it there because it was nearby. And of course, they forgot to put the oil back in the engine. And so I don't know if they pushed the vehicle back or they towed it back to the repair shop. And the owner comes out and says, "You know something, dude? Yeah, we ruined your engine, but we'll fix it for you." And he said, "What do you mean you'll fix it? It's a brand new Jeep. I've only had it for 500 miles. What are you going to do?" And the guy said, "We're going to let our mechanics tear the engine apart, see if there's anything wrong with it, and then we'll put it back together again, and you'll have your Jeep." And my friend said, "Steve, is this how it works?" And I said, "No, that's not how it works. If your engine's fried, which we suspect it is, you're entitled to have that vehicle, fixed by the local Jeep dealer." So my friend had the vehicle towed to a Jeep dealer. He got an estimate on a short block because they said, "Hey, look, this engine's been lunched," which is an old school term, lunched. And so we filed a lawsuit. And in Michigan and in many states, Michigan's got a law called the Motor Vehicle Service and Repair Act. And the Motor Vehicle Service and Repair Act says if you've got to sue a repair facility for a botched repair, not only can you get their actual damages paid to you on your behalf, but you can also get them to pay your attorney fees and court costs on your behalf. So you don't have to worry about how much it's going to cost to hire an attorney to chase after a place that does something like this. So we filed the lawsuit. And interestingly enough, the minute we filed the lawsuit, I got contacted by an insurance carrier who just said, "Yeah, we'll take care of it. We'll buy your guy a new engine, whatever it's going to take." And sure enough, that's what they did. They paid my attorney fees also. And I asked the guy, I'm curious, why didn't you guys just take care of this the second my client showed back up and said, "Hey, you guys just ruined my engine"? And the insurance carrier guy says, "Well, you know something, it might be because this insurance policy only covers litigation. It doesn't cover other claims." So that could be it. I don't know. The guy could have been pulling my leg. I don't know. But all I know is they took care of my friend's engine in his Jeep, and they paid his attorney fees and court costs also. And it was a big hassle. And I tell people all the time, I say, look, no one's going to get rich off these cases. You're lucky if you get back to zero. So you're better off if this doesn't happen to you. You wish it doesn't happen to you. You hope it doesn't happen to you. But if it does happen to you, there's things you can do. So I always tell people you should watch out for this. And by watch out for this, I mean if you've got to take your vehicle someplace to have the oil changed by somebody else, watch them while they do the work. Most oil change places will actually pull the dipstick out afterwards and check the oil. Make sure they do that. I hate to say this, but I take my vehicles into a couple different places around here, and I stand. I'm the guy who stands at the window and just watches them as they do the work. And I looking to make sure the guy underneath there does his stuff, and looking to watch, make sure they put oil into it, and making sure they check the dipstick. And there's an oil change place I go to where I sit in the car while they do the work, and I sit there and look underneath the hood, and I watch the guys do the work, and I'm making sure they do this stuff. I've also had clients with other crazy things happen to them. In fact, this is one of the oddest circumstances of my entire legal career. I had 2 different people contact my office in the same week with oil change horror stories that happened within days of each other at different oil change places. But I mean, I literally thought that the second phone call was the same woman calling me a second time with the same story. I got my car oil change done. I'm driving down the road and the engine blows up. That's story number 1. Story number 2, almost identical. And I'm like, didn't I just talk to you? She's like, no, what are you talking about? I said, okay, I'm sorry. I'm confusing you with somebody else. Interestingly enough, in one of those 2 stories, the client's driving down the road shortly after leaving the oil change place, and the check engine lights come on, the engine stalls, so she, coasts the car over to the side of the road, and she doesn't know anything about cars. So she calls a local gas station, and they send a tow truck out, and the guy pops the hood, and he's looking under there, and he actually spots the oil filter on a cross member underneath the engine. The oil filter fell off and landed on a cross member. So it was sitting right there. And the guy goes, oh, there's your problem, and he holds up the oil filter. So she saves the oil filter, and we call the oil change place, and they tell us to take a flying leap. I kid you not. And so at that point, we file a lawsuit. Same thing happens. Once the lawsuit litigation ensues, and they agree to settle the case. Don't know why they forced us to sue them, but they did. Now, the other case is a little trickier because the client's driving down the road, the engine seizes, and the check engine lights all come on, and she pulls over to the side of the road, and she doesn't know anything about cars either. She calls a tow truck. Guy comes up, pops the hood, and goes, well, your dipstick's smoking. There's no oil in your engine. She goes, well, I just got an oil change. And the guy goes, oh, that's your problem. He looks underneath the engine. He goes, yeah, your oil filter's missing. Okay? So we file a lawsuit on that one also, and the oil change place actually defended that lawsuit and said, well, you didn't save the oil filter. I kid you not. And my client and I are like, well, how do you save the oil filter that falls off the car while you're driving down the road? And the attorney for the oil change place actually said she should have gone back and walked up the road to look for it because that's evidence. And without that evidence, you can't expect us to take care of this, despite the fact that she just had the oil change done and there's oil all underneath the car. So those are things that can happen. The oil filter can fall off. They can forget to put the oil back in. They can also double gasket the filter. This is a tricky one. And anybody out there who's done an oil change knows this, that when you take the old oil filter off, hopefully you can do it by hand, but if you don't do it by hand, you can use an oil filter wrench and you take it off. And the oil filter comes off, and there's a round rubber gasket that when you put the new one on, that gasket seats the oil filter up against the metal. But you don't have metal on metal, you've got a piece of rubber in there. And the problem is that if an oil filter is not taken off properly, or if it's cranked on too tight and then taken off wrong, if you're not paying attention, the old gasket can sometimes stick to the engine. And when you pull the old filter off, the gasket's not on it. So you take the brand new oil filter and you put it on there, and now you've got 2 gaskets where there ought to only be 1. And if you double gasket a filter, oil can actually leak out of that. And it depends on how well those 2 gaskets seat and so on, but you could actually make it a good distance before anything bad happens. It's also possible that a person can put an oil filter on wrong by cross-threading it. And the oil filter's got threads on the inside, and it screws onto the engine. And so if you actually don't get it seated just right when you start threading it, and you crank it, especially if you're in a hurry at a quick oil change place, you cross-thread it. So what happens is it does kind of go on the engine, and it kind of sticks there. And when they fire the car up, it might not leak a whole lot, or it might not leak at all at first. And then, of course, as you're driving down the road, the filter can just fall off. That's one of the most interesting things about this topic. I wrote an article about this about a year ago that was run on car buying, I think. about, oil change horror stories and what you got to watch out for. And I had people, commenting, and many people saying, yeah, this happened to me. It happened to a friend of mine. I had mechanics chiming in saying, yeah, we had a guy at our place who wasn't that good and he'd screw up like this all the time. I heard people who said, yeah, I worked at an oil change place and we had things happen, just sheer volume. What are you going to do? But this is one where, it can happen, and it depends on how weirdly it's done. But, there's guys out there and there's people out there who work in the industry who take a lot of care with the work they do. And there's also people out there who don't. And I've also heard that some of the oil change places, the guys down in the pit might not be certified master mechanics, if you know what I mean. So sometimes they might not be the best trained, the most skilled, and they might not care all that much, So what, you got to be very, very careful, make sure that they do this stuff right. You might ask, well, how do you know if the guy cross-threaded your filter when you put the oil filter on? Well, how you know is you, number one, make sure that they look underneath the car when they're done doing the oil filter change. But number two, when you drive it home or wherever you go after the oil change, literally, wherever you go, the first time you stop the car and get out of it, shut the engine off, get out, look underneath it, look for drips, okay? It's going to drip if it's got a problem. And that, of course, is the primary problem with a bad oil change, is that the oil that's inside the engine gets out of the engine. You don't want the oil to escape, okay? So anytime you look underneath your car and there's dripping under there, so long as it's not air conditioning condenser, condensation, anything dripping is bad underneath the car, whether it's trans fluid or brake fluid or engine oil, okay? So when you get the oil changed in your car, the very first time you stop and park it someplace, look underneath it. You come out in the morning, look underneath it again. I'm one of these people who I'm fanatical. I'm always looking underneath my car. I've spotted some things. I've actually fixed some problems very, very early. A couple of years ago, I walked by my car one morning and I saw one single drip of something underneath the front end of my car. And I wiped it with my finger and I looked at it and I realized it wasn't engine oil. It was too far north. And it was trans fluid. And I looked, and sure enough, there was a worm gear clamp, a hose clamp, and a piece of hose going to my transmission cooler, and the worm gear clamp had worked itself loose and the end of the rubber hose was rotted a little tiny bit. So I went to the store, bought a new piece of hose, I spliced it in, I yanked the old one off, put the new one in, spliced it together, checked my trans fluid, had to put a tiny little bit in, but I solved that problem before it became worse. And it was because I spotted that little drip underneath my car. So after you get an oil change done in your car, look for things dripping underneath your car. It's another good reason that if you have a driveway or a clean garage, that you can look underneath your car and look for drips. I know people who they keep their garages sparkling clean and they hate to have drips on the floor. So do I. But when I see them, I'm glad I spotted them, because that's a diagnostic tool, looking for things that are dripping underneath your car. So again, the engine could be the oil filter could be double gasketed, it could be cross-threaded. I've also heard of drain plugs falling out, and this is a scary concept. But underneath your car, there's an oil pan, and the oil pan has got a drain plug that screws into it. And when you unscrew that, all the oil comes out of the oil pan. So it's a tricky maneuver, because if you're underneath the car and you're upside down on your back and there's not a lot of room in there, sometimes you unscrew that and you wind up dropping that, the plug into the oil catch thing, or it hits the ground and you get oil all over the place, or if you hold on to it, it might be hot, And so what happens is, guys will take that and they won't necessarily clean it very well, or they'll, put it on as an afterthought, not paying attention to it, and they'll cross-thread that also. I've also heard of people who cranked that on so tight that they stripped it. Just crazy. But, I know that people find it so hard to believe that these kinds of crazy things can happen in an auto repair. All you've got to do is try to remove the lug nuts on a car when some guys used an impact wrench to put them on and he didn't care about how hard he put them on. Okay? Everybody's encountered this before, where you get a brand new set of tires put in your car and you've got to change one a little while later, you get a flat or something, and next thing you know, you're out there with a breaker bar and you can't undo them because they're cranked on so tight. So, people aren't always the best when it comes to how tight they make these things. So the oil the oil drain plug shouldn't be cranked on so tight that it takes major power tools to remove it. But once in a while, crazy stuff like that happens. So these things happen. It's possible that it could happen to you. So if you take your vehicle to get an oil change done, number one, save the receipt. Number two, watch them while they do the work. Make sure they do everything that appears to make sense to you. and then make sure they check the dipstick and show you the oil, okay? When you get home, assuming you make it home, okay, look underneath your car, look for drips. Nothing dripping, great, you're all set. Day or two later, check your oil, make sure your oil's topped off. If it is, you're good to go, you're probably fine. If anything happens at all, okay, and you think your plug fell out, your oil filter fell off, number one, do what you can to minimize the amount of damage done to your vehicle. Shut your engine off immediately, get the car, off the road, and then you will have to notify the shop immediately to let them know what happened and document what happened. So nowadays with smartphones, take pictures, okay? Oil filter falls off, take a picture. Something bad happens, there's a big trail of oil behind your car, take a picture. Document it all, then contact the shop and say, guys, here's what happened, I expect you to take care of it for me. If they take care of you, which they very well might do, okay, you're all set. If they refuse to take care of it for you, then you contact an attorney, because there are laws out there, like the Motor Vehicle Service and Repair Act, that says that if they damage your vehicle while they're attempting to do a repair for you and they charge you money, you have the right to sue them for damages plus your attorney fees and court costs. And since the attorney fees and court costs are paid for by the other side, you don't need to worry about it. Most attorneys will talk to you about these cases for free, and they'll even take these cases from you for free, meaning we'll do them on a contingency where we simply get paid if we win. If we don't win, we don't get paid. That's how it works. So those are the oil change horror stories. Like I said, in 23 years of practice, I've handled a couple dozen of them maybe, and it could happen to you. I've been getting fewer of them lately though, fewer of them. And I think that's because they're taking care of more people before the lawsuits get filed, which is good. I've got no problem with a shop or a business that actually has something happen, go wrong, and then there's harm done to somebody. I've got no problem with that so long as they step up and take care of it. Okay, so if a shop makes a mistake and they step up and take care of it, that's the way things ought to be. They take care of it. Wonderful. Got no problem at all. So those are the oil change horror stories. That's going to wrap it up for this week's Lehto's Law. As always, questions or comments, feel free to contact me at lehtoslaw.com, LEHTOSLAW.com. I'm also on Twitter at Steve Lehto, at STEVELEHTO. And you can subscribe and rate this show on Stitcher, iTunes, and YouTube. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.